WarScholar.com presents a quick history of the Pacific War portion of World War II. Part 1, 1940 to 1941. World War II began with Germany's September 1939 invasion of Poland. Until Japan's attack on the U.S., the Pacific War involved a great deal of political negotiation between the U.S., Japan, participants of the European portion of World War II. Japan worked to develop its access to resources, especially oil, to gain the advantage in any future conflict over its activities in East Asia. March 1940, Japan sets up a puppet government in Nanjing, China. July 1940, the U.S. begins developing a two-ocean navy and restricts the export of oil and metals, which hurts Japan, which depends on foreign oil. 2 months later, Japan moves troops into Indochina with little protest from the Vichy France government. October, Britain refuses Japan's request to close the Burma Road, which is used to supply Chinese troops fighting the Japanese. By November, Japan has concluded major agreements for oil from the Dutch East Indies. In April 1941, Japan signs a neutrality agreement with the USSR. Shortly afterwards, the U.S. begins to provide aid to the USSR. In July, Japan makes the decision to take French bases in Indochina. Japan calls its Atlantic ships home in case of war. That same month, Japan reforms its government into a more moderate one to ease tensions between itself and the U.S. At the end of the month, France has conceded to Japanese demands for its bases in Indochina. Britain and the U.S. freeze Japanese assets in their countries, and Japan freezes their assets in Japan. The Dutch then freeze Japanese assets and oil contracts. As a result, Japan suffers a dangerously sharp drop in oil supplies. In July, Japan nearly damages a U.S. gunboat in China while it attacks Chongqing. Japan apologizes, but tensions remain. Days later, the U.S. severely restricts oil exports, hurting Japan even more. Japan offers concessions, which the U.S. rejects. The U.S. and Britain agree to warn Japan that any military movement into Dutch or British possessions in the Southwest Pacific could lead to war with the U.S. These possessions have oil and other resources Japan badly needs. In September, Japan decides to negotiate with the U.S. until October before declaring war. In October, Japan forms a tougher, more militaristic government, but war is not declared. Japan begins to prepare its citizens for air raids. In November, Japan increases its attempts at negotiation with the U.S., but also secretly sends naval vessels towards the vicinity of Hawaii. By the end of the month, Japan seems to be preparing to invade Malaya, and the U.S. puts forth an ultimatum for Japan to withdraw from China and Indochina. U.S., Asiatic, and Pacific fleets are put on alert for war. Japan rejects the U.S. ultimatum. Japanese naval movements raise fear that Japan will invade Malaysia and the East Indies. December 1st, Japan secretly decides to go to war against the U.S. Despite a direct request from Roosevelt to the Emperor of Japan for peace, on December 7th, Japan attacks multiple targets, including Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor attack badly damages the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In the following days and through December, Japan captures U.S. troops in China and attacks various strategically placed islands in the Pacific. Japan attacks Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Thailand, and other British, Dutch, and U.S. positions in the Pacific. There is some military resistance, but initial Japanese attacks across the Pacific have been generally successful. By the end of 1942, while a handful of Allied positions are holding against the Japanese, most Allied forces are in retreat. This has been a WarScholar.com presentation of the Pacific War, Part 1, 1940 to 1941.